Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, two sides of a forgotten conflict, Chechnya and its conspicuous absence from the global news agenda. The Pentagon steps up its propaganda campaign in Iraq,
Washington,
while the U.S. media pull their troops out of the war zone. North Korea and a healthy Kim Jong-il. What's wrong with this picture? And a beatbox musician goes into the kitchen and cooks up a smorgasbord of sounds.
Now I'm going to add the and
Welcome back. There was an earthquake in Chechnya last week, which hardly registered in most of the world media. Recent parliamentary elections there got even less play. This is in a territory that, in the last 15 years, has fought two bloody wars of independence with Russia and sits right next door to the conflict between Georgia and South Ossetia. The Russian media's downplaying of this story is not exactly news. Most of them have been towing the Kremlin line for years. But where's the Arab media coverage of this conflict between Muslim Chechens and Moscow? And what about the rest of the global media? That's our starting point this week. Chechnya, a place the mainstream news media are effectively ignoring, and where you can go on the internet to get the story.
This is how Grozny, the capital of the Chechen Republic, looked like 2 years ago after two wars in the Republic. Damaged buildings, empty streets and debris all around. And that is the current view of greater part of the city. This building was not restored, it was completely rebuilt.
There isn't much news about Chechnya these days, and what there is, the story of a region slowly coming back to life, is usually filtered through Moscow. Pavel Andreev works for the Russian news agency RIA Novosti.
The situation in Chechnya no longer provides rolling flow of information. If you go into comparative analysis of what was the place several years ago and what it is now, that's a different story. The change in the mood, the change in the environment is vivid, and that's something which is being appreciated a lot by the Russians and the Russian media.
But here's some of what isn't being reported. Natalia Estimarova is a journalist and human rights activist from Chechnya. She won an award for her work there from the human rights organization Reach All Women in War.
Official news of Chechnya's progress is widely reported. They say that Chechnya is getting better, more stable. Fantastic, luxurious buildings are being constructed. But the majority of people who've lost their homes are suffering. They haven't been rehoused.
There's a world of difference between the way Russian news media cover Chechnya now and the way they once did. I covered the First Chechen War, which started in 1994. Russian news reporters had just shed their Soviet-era shackles and showed great courage, routinely risking their own safety to cover the story. Their uncensored reporting turned Russian public opinion against the war. Then came Vladimir Putin's clampdown on the news media.
By the time the second campaign started, the Russian authorities had managed to impose control over almost all TV channels, and our famous NTV channel that provided people with absolute unbiased information during the first campaign actually had changed beyond recognition by the time the second war started.
Then the Chechens took the war to Russia. First, there was the Moscow theater siege in 2002, and then the Beslan school siege, when Chechen rebels took more than 1,000 children hostage. The violent end to that siege and the relatively uncritical coverage of the story on Russian TV showed how far media freedoms in the country had fallen.
Putin stated that Russia was going to win the information war. In fact, what they decided was that they were going to kill any independent media attempt to cover the war.
Some Russian journalists who refused to give up on the Chechnya story paid for their dedication with their lives. Anna Politkovskaya, a reporter with the Novaya Gazeta newspaper, was murdered.
After Anna died, her place was not taken up by anyone. Unfortunately, her example has not given others the impetus to write in the same courageous and frank way.
If President Putin's plan was to crack down on and intimidate the Russian media, it worked. The story was off the news agenda in Moscow and beyond.
Прошло уже 9 лет, как началась война, но до сих пор
9 years on, neither Russian nor foreign journalists are given free access to Chechnya.
и российских, и иностранных под запретом.
Chechnya seems to slip off the radar for many news stations around the world. Chechnya, it appears, will seem to go through the motions of a seemingly democratic region without officially being checked by outside sources. As far as the Russian media is concerned, if it's not broken, then what's the point in fixing it?
Western media also pay little attention to the Chechnya story, as do Arab media, even though 90% of Chechens share a religion with most of the Arab world. They too are Muslims.
It's a smaller part of the so-called Muslim world. It's distant. There are other countries in between. And maybe we didn't lose interest, but there are so many other problems between Palestine, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And since the end of the fighting in Chechnya, it's not front page news. Even if the news is bad, it's not bad enough to attract attention.
Even journalists who have fled to the internet to report the story there are seen as a threat by the authorities. One well-known site is Kafkaz Center, a Muslim website. And then there is Ingushetia Truth, whose editor, Magomed Yevloyev, was murdered this year.
Публиковались новости Ингушетии, а новости это страшные.
The website was putting out news of terrorist attacks, which were happening on an almost daily basis. It also reported special operations, which were supposedly aimed at rebels, but actually targeted the civilian population.
Но и страдают абсолютно ни в чем не повинные люди.
Still, the Russian authorities have a much harder time shutting down independent voices on the net than on the mainstream media. That's just the nature of the new media.
There was obviously a widespread information warfare on the internet. There has been a lot of websites dedicated to the issues of Chechnya and the war in Chechnya and human rights in Chechnya. So this is something everyone was closely monitoring, and many of the websites are still there.
As long as the Russian mainstream media are gagged by the Kremlin and the attention of the international media is elsewhere, there is little reason to believe that Chechnya and its people will get the media coverage the story deserves. Here's how our Global Village voices see the reporting of Chechnya.
Getting objective information these days from Chechnya is very hard. As a journalist, I rarely trust anything except for the stories of people that I know that have been there, or a number of independent journalists working in the region. You have to realize that the situation in Chechnya is very complicated. Now, unless you're working for the Russian state-sponsored media, it's quite hard to even visit the area. Some people do manage, but mostly they are under the protection, and that also means the censorship, of both the Russian and the Chechen government. Luckily, talented journalists have always found ways around it. Their reports are currently our only objective source of information.
The only way to get accurate information is to visit Russian opposition websites or foreign mass media websites. The totalitarian authorities in Chechnya are much more powerful than in any other region of the country. If you don't agree, don't say anything about it publicly, or it could result in very big problems.
We're always open to more opinions on the output of the worldwide news media. To make your views known, email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. We have the technology to get you on the air as one of our Global Village voices. Time now for Listening Post News Bites. No one knows when the U.S. military will pull out of Iraq, and it turns out most of the American media aren't waiting around to find out. The Washington Post reports that the number of embeds, that is, journalists embedded with American forces, has decreased in the last year from 219 to just 39. That's not necessarily bad news, since embedded journalists are limited to reporting just one part of the story, the American side. But it's not just embeds. At the outset of the war, 12 U.S. newspapers and news agencies maintained full-time bureaus in Baghdad.
It's beginning to look more and more like the winning side has been determined.
That number is now down to 4. The Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Associated Press. There's been similar shrinkage on the TV side. As the level of violence in Iraq decreases, the coverage of the story is disappearing in the U.S. media. Then there's Afghanistan, where the British government has concluded it's being outflanked by the Taliban when it comes to propaganda circulated through new media. Britain is now considering a plan to supply people there with mobile phones equipped with cameras. That would allow ordinary Afghanis to make short films about their lives and show how things have improved since the Taliban lost power. Those films would then be disseminated to counteract the popular anti-Western videos the Taliban have managed to circulate. Afghanistan has an estimated 6 million mobile phone users, and somewhere around 500,000 Afghanis have access to the net. North Korea will have to try again if it wants to knock down those rumors about the health of its leader, Kim Jong-il. North Korea's state-run TV channel recently broadcast what it called new pictures showing Kim alive and in fact well. However, some sharp-eyed observers noticed that the trees in the shots are far too green for October. They said the pictures were probably taken prior to Kim's last public appearance this past summer. Kim Jong-il failed to attend a rally in September on North Korea's 60th anniversary, and that's what got the rumor mill going. On the other side of the 39th parallel, the South Korean government is out to get more control over what goes on the internet. South Korea is the most wired country on earth. Somewhere around 97% of households there have high-speed internet. The government's proposing a new set of rules which would bring all internet news websites under the same restrictions as newspapers, TV, and radio. South Korea's president said the law was needed to guard against what he calls infodemics, false information that prompts social unrest and then spreads like an epidemic. Critics are arguing that the new law is just a heavy-handed attempt to stifle criticism of a government that has faced mass protests on the streets, many of them organized online. After the break, the Pentagon and plans for a new propaganda surge in Iraq.